The champagne in Jack's glass had gone warm, but the cold realization settling in his chest froze him to the bone. Across the candlelight of the anniversary dinner, his wife's hand didn't reach for his. It drifted, almost imperceptibly, to brush against the cuff of his best friend's suit. It was a micro-betrayal, a silence that spoke louder than any argument, hinting at a life growing inside her that couldn't possibly belong to the man sitting at the head of the table. If you are drawn to stories where the deepest scars are hidden behind the most polished smiles and where the truth waits years to exact its price, stay with me, because the hardest part isn't leaving, it's coming back. The crystal chandelier above the dining table at Le Cuckoo seemed to vibrate with the collective hum of New York's elite. It was a noise Jack Thorne had grown accustomed to over the last decade, the sound of deals being struck, reputations being polished, and money shifting hands. Tonight, however, the noise felt distant, muffled by the pounding of his own heart. "Attention, everyone, please," Rose said, tapping her spoon against her champagne flute. The sharp ting-ting-ting cut through the ambient jazz. Jack looked at his wife. She was radiant in emerald silk, the fabric draping perfectly over her slender frame. Her smile was practiced, the one she used for donors at her gallery, but her eyes held a frantic, glistening brightness that Jack hadn't seen before. Beside him, Silas Vance, Jack's business partner and oldest friend, shifted in his seat. Silas took a long sip of his scotch, his knuckles white around the glass. "Jack and I have some news," Rose continued, her voice trembling with an emotion the room interpreted as joy. She reached out and placed her hand over Jack's, her palm damp and cold. "After 10 years of marriage and so much focus on our careers, we've been blessed. I'm pregnant." The table erupted, gasps of delight, applause, and the scraping of chairs as guests stood to offer toasts. "A legacy," someone shouted. "Finally a Thorne heir." Jack sat perfectly still. He felt the weight of Rose's hand on his, a physical anchor to a reality that had just shattered. He watched the faces around him, the envy, the happiness, the calculation. Then his gaze drifted to Silas. Silas wasn't clapping. He was staring at the tablecloth, a muscle in his jaw jumping rhythmically. When he finally looked up, his eyes didn't meet Jack's. They locked onto Rose with a mixture of relief and terror. Pregnant. The word echoed in Jack's mind, stripping away the noise of the party. 6 months ago, Jack had visited a specialist on the Upper East Side. It had been a private inquiry, born of a vague curiosity about why they hadn't conceived despite not using protection for years. The diagnosis had been clinical, absolute, and devastating. Azoospermia, congenital, irreversible. He hadn't told Rose. He hadn't told anyone. He had wanted to process the grief of his genetic dead end alone before bringing it into their marriage. He had planned to discuss adoption, or perhaps donor options, on their anniversary trip next week. But now, here was the miracle. "Jack," Rose whispered, her smile straining at the edges as the applause died down. She squeezed his hand, her nails digging into his skin. "Darling, aren't you going to say something?" The room fell silent, waiting for the expectant father to speak. The pressure was physical, a heavy blanket of expectation. Jack slowly withdrew his hand from hers. He picked up his napkin and dabbed the corner of his mouth, though he hadn't eaten a bite. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, for the first time in months. He saw the faint tremor in her lip. He saw the way she leaned almost imperceptibly toward Silas. He didn't see love. He saw survival. He stood up. He was a tall man, commanding in his silence, known in the architectural world for his ability to see the structural integrity of a building just by looking at the blueprints. He was looking at the blueprint of his marriage now, and the foundation was rot. "To the truth," Jack said, raising his glass. His voice was steady, devoid of warmth, but rich with a dark, terrifying calm. Rose's smile faltered. "Jack? To the things we build," he continued, turning his gaze directly to Silas, who looked as if he might be sick. "And the things we hide." He drank the champagne in one swallow, the bubbles burning his throat. He placed the glass down with a deliberate clink. "I'm afraid I'm not feeling well," Jack said to the table, buttoning his jacket. "Please enjoy the dessert. I've already had enough." He walked out of the restaurant without looking back, leaving his wife surrounded by applause that was slowly turning into confused whispers. The cool night air of Manhattan hit him, but it did nothing to numb the fire of betrayal spreading through his veins. He checked his watch. The banks would open in 9 hours. He had a lot of work to do before then. Dawn over Manhattan was usually Jack's favorite time. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Tribeca penthouse, the city looked like a circuit board waking up, gray turning to gold. Today, however, Jack wasn't admiring the view. He was dismantling it. He had been awake since he returned from the restaurant, sitting at his mahogany desk in the study, bathed in the blue glow of his laptop. He didn't throw vases. He didn't shred wedding photos. Instead, he logged into their accounts. With the clinical detachment of a surgeon, he moved his personal inheritance and premarital assets into offshore holding accounts. He initiated the sale of his stock options in the firm he had built with Silas. By 6 a.m., Jack Thorne was technically liquid and effectively homeless. He heard the soft click of the bedroom door handle. Rose emerged wrapped in a cashmere robe, clutching a mug of tea with both hands. She looked pale, the adrenaline of the previous night replaced by a nervous, hungover fragility. She paused in the doorway, gauging the temperature of the room. "You didn't come to bed," she said softly. Her voice was designed to disarm, a mix of concern and wounded pride. Jack closed his laptop. The snap sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I had work to finish." Rose walked further into the room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood. She sat on the edge of the leather sofa, tucking her legs beneath her. "About last night, Jack. I know you were shocked. I know we talked about waiting, but it's a miracle, isn't it? A happy accident." She placed a hand on her flat stomach, a gesture so performative it made Jack's stomach turn. She was doubling down. She was betting on his decency, on the assumption that he would never question the sanctity of a pregnancy. Jack stood up and walked to the window. He didn't look at her. "I resigned from the firm this morning. The email is already in Silas's inbox." "What?" Rose's tea splashed over the rim of her mug. You resigned? Jack, are you insane? We have a baby coming. You have a baby coming," Jack corrected, turning to face her. His face was a mask of granite. Rose froze. "What is that supposed to mean?" Her eyes narrowed, the panic flaring behind them. "How can you be so cruel? This is your child." Jack walked over to the desk and picked up a single sheet of paper, a medical report from 6 months ago. He didn't hand it to her. He just left it on the edge of the desk. "Azoospermia," he said. The word hung in the air, foreign and absolute. Rose blinked. It means 0 sperm count, Rose. Congenital. It means I cannot father children. I never could." Jack's voice dropped an octave, devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "I was going to tell you next week. I was going to suggest we look into donors. But it seems you found a donor all on your own." The color drained from Rose's face so fast she looked like a statue. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. The math was irrefutable. "Jack, wait," she stammered, standing up, reaching for him. It was a mistake. It was one night when you were in Tokyo. I was lonely and Silas was—" "Silas," Jack repeated. He didn't ask, he just confirmed. The name tasted like ash. His best friend, his partner. The betrayal was a complete circle. He picked up the small leather weekender bag he had packed while she slept. "I'm leaving the apartment to you," Jack said, walking toward the door. "My lawyers will send the divorce papers. Irreconcilable differences. I won't cite adultery. I won't cite the paternity." Rose was crying now, ugly, gasping sobs. "Why? If you hate me, destroy me. Why keep it quiet?" Jack paused with his hand on the brass doorknob. He looked back at the woman he had loved for 10 years, now just a stranger in a silk robe. "Because I don't want anyone to know I was fool enough to love you," he said, "and because letting you live a lie is a worse punishment than the truth." He opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The elevator arrived instantly, as if the building itself was eager to expel him. As the doors slid shut, he saw Rose sink to the floor, wailing his name. Jack didn't blink. He pressed the button for the lobby. The descent began. 5 years in London had taught Jack Thorne that rain wasn't just weather, it was architecture. It created walls of water, ceilings of gray cloud, and floors of slick pavement. It suited him. It washed things away. Jack stood on the balcony of his converted warehouse apartment in Southwark, overlooking the Thames. The air smelled of wet brick and the salty, tidal churn of the river. Inside, his phone had been buzzing intermittently for an hour. He knew why. The Pritzker Prize Committee had made the announcement at noon. He was the newest laureate, the architectural world's highest honor bestowed upon the man of steel and silence, as Architectural Digest had dubbed him. He didn't pick up the phone. Instead, he took a sip of lukewarm espresso and turned back to the drafting table that dominated his living space. His life here was a study in minimalism. No photos, no clutter, just clean lines, raw concrete, and work. He had buried himself in blueprints, designing museums in Oslo and libraries in Kyoto, buildings that were praised for their brutal honesty. The critics loved the phrase. They had no idea how literal it was. Jack walked over to his laptop, not to check the congratulations flooding his inbox, but to perform his monthly ritual. It was a masochistic habit he couldn't break. He opened a private browser window and navigated to the New York social pages. There they were. The photograph was from a charity gala at the Met. Rose looked older, her smile tighter, the lines around her eyes masked by expensive creams, but visible to a man who used to study her face while she slept. Beside her stood Silas. He had gained weight, his face flushed with the kind of ruddy complexion that suggested too many business lunches and too much scotch. And between them, holding both their hands, was a boy, Leo, 4 years old. Jack zoomed in on the image. The boy had Silas's dark, curly hair, but there was something in his expression, a watchful, solemn quality, that didn't belong to Silas or Rose. The caption read, Rose Thorne and Silas Vance, partners in life and business, continuing the legacy of the Thorne Group, despite the sudden abandonment by its founder 5 years ago. Abandonment! The word was a rusty nail driven into Jack's chest. According to the narrative Rose had spun, Jack had snapped. The pressure of the business had been too much, or perhaps he had a secret lover in Europe. He had fled, leaving his pregnant wife to fend for herself. Silas, the noble best friend, had stepped up to care for the mother and child, eventually marrying her to provide stability. It was a perfect story. It made them heroes. It made Jack a monster. He could have ended it with a single press release. He could have released the medical records. He could have burned their reputation to the ground. But he remembered the look in the boy's eyes in the photo. Leo, an innocent byproduct of deceit. If Jack destroyed them, he destroyed the boy's world too. The intercom buzzed, startling him. Delivery, Mr. Thorne, the concierge's voice crackled. And there's a journalist from the Times in the lobby. She says she won't leave until she gets a quote about the Pritzker. Tell her, Jack said, his voice raspy from disuse, that the work speaks for itself. I have nothing to add. He cut the connection. He looked back at the screen, at the little boy who would grow up calling a traitor father. Jack closed the laptop. He walked back to his drafting table and picked up a charcoal pencil. He was working on a new commission, a cathedral in Berlin. He began to shade the heavy, dark arches of the entrance. He would build a sanctuary for others, a place for confession and truth, even if he was condemned to live in a prison of his own making. He was the architect of his own exile, and the walls were holding firm. New York had changed in 10 years. The skyline was denser, sharper, more aggressive. But nothing was quite as aggressive as the silence that fell over the press room at Hudson Yards when Jack Thorne stepped onto the podium. He was 45 now, his hair peppered with iron gray at the temples, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than the cars of most people in the room. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply placed his hands on the lectern and looked out at the sea of flashing cameras and hungry reporters. To his right, under a silk sheet, stood the architectural model of the Apex, the 90-story residential tower that was set to redefine the West Side. Architecture, Jack began, his voice amplified and crisp, is the art of permanence. It is about building things that cannot be hidden, things that stand true against the wind and the rot. In the front row of the VIP section, Rose sat rigid. She was gripping her clutch so hard her knuckles were white. Beside her, Silas shifted his weight, adjusting his tie. They were the power couple of the art and real estate world, the patrons of the project's cultural center. They had to be here. Their absence would have been a headline. Jack's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on them. He didn't blink. He didn't glare. He just looked, a neutral, dissecting gaze that stripped them naked right there in front of half the city. A reporter from the New York Post raised a hand. "Mr. Thorne, you've been in London for a decade. Many said you fled New York after a personal breakdown. Why return now? Is this a redemption tour?" The room tensed. Everyone knew the rumors, the unstable genius who abandoned his pregnant wife. Jack's expression didn't change. "A building requires a solid foundation," he said smoothly, leaning into the microphone. "If the ground is unstable, you don't build. You wait. You let the soil settle. You let the toxic elements wash away." He held Silas's gaze as he said toxic elements. Silas swallowed hard, his face flushing a deep angry red. "I returned," Jack continued, "because I am finally ready to build something honest in this city." He pulled the silk sheet off the model. The crowd gasped. It was a stunning structure, a shard of glass and steel that looked like a dagger piercing the sky. It was beautiful, dangerous, and utterly transparent. After the presentation, the room dissolved into a cocktail mixer. Jack was immediately surrounded by investors, but he carved a path through them, heading straight for the champagne bar where Rose and Silas were huddled. They froze as he approached. The air around them seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Jack," Silas said, his voice too loud, trying to project dominance. He extended a hand. "Quite the show, dramatic as always." Jack looked at the outstretched hand, then up at Silas's face. He didn't take it. He just took a sip of his sparkling water. "Silas," Jack acknowledged, his tone flat, "you look prosperous." "We are," Rose interjected, stepping between them, her voice brittle. "We're very happy, Jack. We have a beautiful life, a beautiful son." She said it as a challenge, or perhaps a shield. "Don't you dare hurt him." Jack looked at her. The anger he expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, there was just a vast, arctic pity. "I'm sure he is beautiful, Rose," Jack said softly. "Children usually are, before the world gets to them." "How is he?" "Leo, isn't it?" Rose paled. "He's 10. He's wonderful." 10, Jack repeated. "A significant age. Old enough to start asking questions. Old enough to notice that he doesn't look like his father." Silas stepped forward, his chest puffing out. "Watch it, Thorne. If you say one word to the press—" "I don't need to speak to the press, Silas," Jack interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that only they could hear. "I just built a 90-story glass tower. I deal in transparency now. You're the ones living in a house of cards." He set his glass down on the table next to Silas's untouched scotch. "Enjoy the party," Jack said. "I'll be seeing you around. After all, I'm not going anywhere this time." He walked away, merging back into the crowd of admirers. Rose watched him go, a tremor running through her body. For 10 years, she had feared his ghost. Now the man was back, and he was far more terrifying than the memory ever was. The Chelsea Gallery was suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of expensive perfume and the drone of polite, meaningless conversation. Jack hated these events. He was only here because the gallery director was a board member for his new Hudson Yards project, and attendance was mandatory politics. He had spent 20 minutes nodding at donors before slipping away, to a quieter corridor in the back, where the less marquee pieces were displayed. He needed silence. He needed air. Instead, he found a boy. The child was sitting on a velvet bench, ignoring the abstract paintings on the walls. He was about 10 years old, wearing a suit that looked slightly uncomfortable, his legs swinging rhythmically. But his attention was entirely focused on a black sketchbook resting on his knees. Jack paused. Most children at these events were glued to iPads or looking for the dessert tray. This boy was working. Jack moved closer, his footsteps silent on the polished concrete floor. He peered over the boy's shoulder. The sketch was crude but remarkably ambitious, a charcoal study of the gallery's skylight, capturing the complex grid of steel beams overhead. "Your perspective is slightly off," Jack said quietly. The boy didn't jump. He didn't look scared. He simply stopped drawing, considered the page, and then looked up. Jack felt a physical jolt. The eyes looking back at him were Silas's eyes. Dark, round, framed by thick lashes. But the gaze was analytical, cool, and frighteningly familiar. It was the same look Jack saw in the mirror every morning. It's not off, the boy said, his voice high but steady. I'm drawing it from how it feels, not how it looks. The beams are heavy. I want them to look heavy. Jack raised an eyebrow. Structural expressionism, a bold choice for a 10-year-old. The boy half smiled. I'm Leo. I know, Jack said. He realized too late how creepy that might sound, but Leo didn't seem to mind. I'm Jack. You're the architect, Leo said, his eyes widening slightly. The one who built the glass tower. My father hates that building. He says it's an eyesore. Does he? Jack felt a dark amusement curl in his chest. And what do you think? Leo looked down at his sketchbook, shading a corner with his thumb. I think it looks like it's going to take off, like a rocket. I like it. Jack felt a lump form in his throat, a sudden, sharp ache of grief he hadn't prepared for. Here was a mind that resonated with his own, a sensibility that craved order and beauty, trapped in the house of a man who valued neither. May I? Jack asked, gesturing to the pencil. Leo handed it to him. Jack leaned down, the expensive fabric of his suit straining as he sketched a quick, corrective line on the paper. If you want weight, he murmured, don't press harder. Use shadow. Let the empty space do the work. The heaviest things are often the ones you can't see. Leo watched, mesmerized. Show me more! Leo! The shriek cut through the quiet corridor like a siren. Rose appeared at the end of the hall, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She rushed forward, her heels clacking violently against the floor, and positioned herself between Jack and the boy, grabbing Leo's shoulder with a protective fierceness. Get away from him, she hissed at Jack, her chest heaving. Leo looked up, confused. Mom? We were just talking about drawing. Go find your father, Leo. Now, Rose commanded, her voice trembling. He's by the entrance. Go! Leo looked from his mother to Jack, sensing the static electricity in the air. He snatched his sketchbook back. Bye, Jack, he whispered, before jogging away. Rose waited until the boy was out of earshot before turning on Jack. What are you doing? Are you stalking us? Jack stood to his full height, dusting charcoal dust from his fingers. He looked at the woman who had stolen a decade of fatherhood from him, and then he looked at the empty hallway where the boy had vanished. I didn't seek him out, Rose. Fate has a sense of humor, Jack said coldly, but you should be careful. Careful of what? Genetics, Jack said, turning to leave. You can lie to the world and you can lie to the boy, but you can't lie to his nature. He's an architect, Rose. He sees structure, and sooner or later he's going to notice the cracks in yours. The reception desk at Thorne Architecture was designed to be intimidating. A slab of polished black granite that looked less like a desk and more like a barricade. Yet when Jack stepped out of the elevator, he found his receptionist, a steely woman named Mara, who terrified most interns, looking flustered. Standing on the other side of the granite was Leo. He was soaking wet. His school blazer was dark with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his sneakers squeaked against the pristine marble floor. But in his arms, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag to keep it dry, was the sketchbook. Mr. Thorne, Mara said, relief washing over her face. I told him you were in meetings. I was about to call security, but he said, I said I had an appointment, Leo lied smoothly, though his ears turned pink. He looked at Jack, his chin jutting out with a defiance that was entirely Silas, but his eyes held a pleading vulnerability that was entirely his own. You said my perspective was off. I fixed it. Jack stared at the boy. He should send him home. He should call Rose and have her collect this walking complication. Every second the boy stood here was a violation of the silent treaty Jack had signed with his departure 10 years ago. Come with me, Jack said. He led the boy past the rows of stunned junior architects into his private office at the corner of the building. The room was a sanctuary of glass and light, suspended above the gray city. Sit, Jack commanded, pointing to the Eames chair. Leo sat, placing the plastic-wrapped book on the glass table. My mom thinks I'm at chess club. She hates it when I draw. She says artists are unstable. Your mother values stability, Jack said dryly, moving to his liquor cabinet to pour himself a water. She prefers things that stay where she puts them, people included. He walked over and sat opposite the boy. Let's see it. Leo unwrapped the book and flipped to a page. It was a study of the Brooklyn Bridge. The lines were cleaner now, the shading more confident. He had listened. He had applied the lesson from the gallery. Better, Jack admitted, but you're still drawing the bridge as if it's sitting on the water. It doesn't sit. It pulls. It's in a constant state of tension. That's what holds it up. He grabbed a red drafting pencil and leaned in. For the next hour, the outside world ceased to exist. Jack forgot about the Pritzker, the betrayal, and the bitterness. He was just an architect teaching a student how to see. He showed Leo how to calculate load, how light changes the perception of mass, how a building must breathe. Leo absorbed it all like a sponge. He was brilliant, terrifyingly so. My dad, Silas, Leo corrected himself, looking down at his hands. He says architecture is just real estate with a bigger ego. He wants me to study finance. He says that's where the power is. Jack paused, the pencil hovering over the paper. He looked at the boy, the biological son of the man who had stolen his life. By all rights, Leo should have been a reminder of Jack's failure. But as he watched Leo trace the line of an arch, Jack realized the ultimate irony. Silas had the boy's blood, but he didn't have his mind. Jack did. Power isn't about money, Leo, Jack said quietly. Power is about creating the space in which people live their lives. If you design the room, you control the conversation. Never forget that. Leo looked up, his eyes shining. Is that why you built the Apex? To control the conversation? Something like that. Suddenly, the intercom buzzed. Mr. Thorne? Mara's voice was urgent. There is a Mrs. Vance on the line. She's hysterical. She's tracking her son's phone. The bubble burst. The reality of the feud rushed back into the room. Leo froze, looking at his backpack where his phone was likely pinging its location. I have to go. Yes, Jack said, his voice hardening again. You do. Leo grabbed his book and scrambled to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, looking back at the man sitting alone in the glass tower. Thank you, Jack, he whispered. Leo, Jack called out. The boy stopped. Jack reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his own fountain pen, a heavy black lacquer instrument he had used to sign the contracts for the Apex. He walked over and slipped it into the boy's blazer pocket. Don't draw with charcoal anymore, Jack said. It smudges too easily. If you're going to make a mark, make it permanent. The boy touched the pocket, nodded once, and ran out. Jack walked to the window and watched the rain streak the glass. He knew he had just crossed a line. He was no longer just the exile. He was the interloper. And he knew, with a heavy certainty, that the boy would come back. Because now Leo knew the difference between a father who paid the bills and a father who understood the soul. The grand ballroom of the Apex was a floating island of light, suspended 90 stories above Manhattan. Outside, the wind howled against the reinforced glass, but inside the air was still, scented with orchids and expensive champagne. Jack stood at the center of the room, the master of ceremonies accepting accolades for the building that had finally pierced the city's skyline. Rose and Silas were there, of course. They were circling the periphery like sharks in a tank, smiling too brightly, shaking too many hands. They had to be seen supporting the project to maintain their status as the city's benevolent power couple. Leo was seated at table 4, looking miserable in a miniature tuxedo. He wasn't eating. He was staring at a folded poster board resting against his chair leg, his science fair project, which he had insisted on bringing because the fair was the next morning. Jack made his rounds, eventually stopping at their table. The music dipped, creating a pocket of silence that drew the eyes of the nearby guests, investors, board members, and the gossip columnist from the Times. A magnificent night, Jack, Silas said, standing up. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture of possessive fatherhood that made Jack's jaw tighten. We were just telling Leo how generous it was of you to invite us, considering the history. History is just data we haven't processed yet, Jack replied smoothly. He looked down at Leo. Is that the project? Leo looked up, his eyes lighting up with the intellectual spark that Jack had come to recognize. Yes, it's on inheritance. Mendelian genetics. Rose's glass clattered onto her saucer. Leo, put that away. This isn't the place. Actually, Jack said, his voice carrying slightly, I'd like to see it. Science is about truth, isn't it? Architecture and genetics aren't so different. They both rely on blueprints. Leo didn't wait for his mother's permission. He unfolded the board. It was a complex family tree, mapping eye color, hair texture, and blood types. I had to map my parents, Leo explained, pointing to the chart, to show dominant and recessive traits. But I found something weird. The atmosphere at the table shifted. The nearby conversations died down as people sensed the shift in frequency. Rose reached out, her fingers trembling. Leo, honey, we can talk about this at home. But the math doesn't work, Mom, Leo said, his voice rising with the frustration of a student who can't balance an equation. He pointed to the box marked father. Everyone says Jack is my father. The papers, you, everyone. So I put Jack as the father. Leo looked at Jack. You're type O, right? I read it in your bio when you had that surgery in London. I am, Jack confirmed. And Mom is type A, Leo continued, pointing to Rose. And I'm type B. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the group. Even those who didn't understand the biology understood the tone. That's impossible, Leo said, looking at his chart, then at the adults. A type O and a type A parent can't make a type B child. It's genetically impossible. The only way I can be type B, he turned his gaze slowly to Silas, was if my father contributed a B allele, and Silas is type AB. Leo was 10 years old. He wasn't trying to destroy a marriage or ruin a reputation. He was just trying to solve a puzzle. But as he looked from Silas to his mother, the realization hit him. The stepfather who had stepped up wasn't a hero. He was just the father. Leo, stop it, Silas snapped, his face turning a violent shade of purple. That's enough. So you're my dad? Leo asked, his voice cracking. For real, since the beginning? The question hung in the air, naked and devastating. The guests at the surrounding tables were staring openly now. The narrative that Rose had carefully constructed for a decade, the story of the abandoned pregnant wife and the noble best friend, was disintegrating in real time. If Silas was the father, the affair had happened while Jack was still married to Rose. Jack hadn't abandoned his child. He had left a wife who was carrying another man's baby. Rose stood up, knocking her chair over. Jack, she whispered, her eyes pleading. Do something. Jack looked at her. He looked at the terror in her eyes, the sheer panic of a socialite watching her pedestal crumble. Then he looked at Leo, the boy who had used logic to cut through a decade of lies. I can't change the blueprint, Rose, Jack said softly, but loud enough for the press to hear. The boy is right. The math doesn't lie. He turned to Leo. You have your answer, Leo. Your calculations are correct. Leo looked at his mother, who was now weeping silently, and then at Silas, who couldn't meet his eyes. The boy's face crumbled, not with sadness, but with the shock of a world rewriting itself. He grabbed his project board, hugged it to his chest like a shield, and ran toward the exit. Leo! Rose screamed, chasing after him. Silas stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of 100 judgment-filled stares before rushing after them. Jack remained standing at the table. He picked up his champagne glass, the crystal catching the light of the chandeliers. He was alone again, but for the first time in 10 years, the room didn't feel empty. It felt clean. The party was over. The cleanup crews were already sweeping away the confetti and the debris of the evening, their vacuums humming a low, monotonous dirge. The scandal had moved from the ballroom to the internet. Jack had checked his phone once to see Thorn Charity Gala, trending alongside hashtags about paternity and secrets. He had turned the phone off. He stood by the private exit at the rear of the tower, his trench coat buttoned against the damp night air. A black town car waited at the curb, its engine idling, ready to take him to JFK. His flight to London departed in 3 hours. Jack! The voice was brittle, like dry leaves stepping on pavement. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Rose. She stood in the shadow of the service entrance. Her emerald dress was wrinkled, her mascara smudged beneath eyes that looked hollowed out. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't look like a curator or a socialite. She looked like a woman standing in the ruins of her own house. "You ruined us," she said. There was no fire in it, just exhaustion. "You knew what he would find. You encouraged him." Jack turned slowly, the flashing lights of the city reflected in the puddles around his shoes. "I didn't teach him to hate you, Rose. I taught him to look at the structure. If the foundation is rotten, gravity does the rest." I just handed him the flashlight. Rose wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "He won't speak to me. He's sitting in the car with Silas, and he won't say a word. He looked at me like I was a stranger." "He's grieving," Jack said, his voice void of malice. "He's grieving the father he thought he had, and the mother he thought he knew. He's resilient, though. He has a good mind." "He's my son," she snapped, a faint spark of her old defiance returning. "He is," Jack agreed, "and he is Silas's son. You have your family now, Rose, the one you made, the one you wanted. You just don't get to pretend it's something else anymore." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, heavy business card. It had no logo, just his name and a private London number. He held it out to her. She stared at it. "What is this?" "For Leo," Jack said, "when he's ready. If he wants to study architecture, real architecture, tell him to call me. I won't be his father, but I can be his teacher." Rose looked at the card, her hand trembling as she took it. It was an act of mercy she knew she didn't deserve. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything I did to you." "Because the boy is innocent," Jack said, turning toward the car. "And because I'm done carrying the weight of your lies. I'm light now, Rose." He opened the car door. The interior was warm and smelled of leather. "Jack?" she called out one last time. He paused, one foot inside the vehicle. "Did you ever love me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Or was I just another project? Something to fix?" Jack looked up at the building he had built. The apex. It pierced the night sky, sharp, honest, and unyielding. It hid nothing. "I loved you enough to leave," he said, "and I love myself enough not to stay." He got in and closed the door. The sound was solid, final. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the stream of taillights flowing out of the city. Jack didn't look back at the woman standing in the rain, or the skyscraper that bore his mark. He leaned his head against the cool glass and watched the city blur into streaks of light. The blueprint was complete. The structure held. He was going home.